Okay, good morning. Happy Wednesday. Today is our 23rd lesson of the semester. Today is day one on the quadratic formula. Last class we graphed some parabolas. That was day one of parabolas. You can see coming up in a few classes is day two of parabolas. Coming up next class on Friday is day two of this brand new thing called the quadratic formula, and the parabolas and the quadratic formula are related. We'll connect them all together today. Coming up next week, remember, is quest number 4. That's on Wednesday, 1 week from today. Any questions on the calendar? Okay. Now let's jump in right here. In this lesson, we learn how to use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. So we're going to skip number 1 entirely and just take a look at number 2. So let's take a look at 2. Come on now. Okay, so here's a graph, and it is a parabola, and the graph for that parabola came from this equation right here, y equals x squared plus 2x minus 5. So if you had to estimate the x-intercepts, what would you say they are? Like this guy right here. What do you think the coordinates are there if we just had to guess? 1.5? Looks like it's a little bit to the left of the middle to me. So maybe 1.4. I feel okay. And 0 is clearly the y. Go ahead and guess the other guy, the other x-intercept. And write down the coordinates right there. So we're just ballparking it. There's no way to know for sure. What do we think? Negative 3.4, comma, 0. Okay, so how are we supposed to actually figure out what those numbers are? Well, in the last class, we found x-intercepts by changing the y equal to 0, right? Or changing the y to 0, make the y equal to 0, and then solve. And in the homework that you did for me last night, you graphed parabolas and you solved equations like that by doing what? Yeah, how would you solve that equation for x? How did you do it in the homework? You factored, right? And every one of the ones in the homework factored. Well, guess what? This one doesn't factor. You can try a 2x2 box, and you'll go through the possibilities, and you will discover that this one is not factorable. Anybody remember the fancy word? Irreducible. That's what this guy turns out to be. So it's not our fault. It just is what it is. So how are we supposed to find these numbers? I mean, this equation has 2 solutions, and the solutions are roughly 1.4 and negative 3.4. But how are we going to get them if the thing doesn't factor? So we need a new tool, and that tool is right here in the box. It is called the quadratic formula. So it says a quadratic equation written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. A, b, and c are just numbers. Has the solutions x equals that beautiful formula right there. Raise your hand if you've seen it before. Only one person has seen this formula before? I don't believe it. Nobody else has seen that formula? Really? You guys, how do you sleep at night? I'm sorry you've never seen this one before. Well, here we are. The world is now our oyster. So there's the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. It just rolls off the tongue. Good news for you is that I'm going to give you that formula on the upcoming quest and test and final exams. So you don't need to memorize it, but with a little bit of practice, it actually, you can memorize it. It's not too difficult to memorize it. Let's see if we can use the formula. That's the most important thing for me. Having some trouble here with my scroll bar. All right, let's give this a shot. Okay, so the equation that we are looking to solve, I will highlight it right up here in blue, is that 0 equals x squared plus 2x minus 5. And we are going to solve that equation by using this fancy new formula. And the first thing we need to do is identify the values of a, b, and c. A is always the number touching x squared. What is it in that equation? It's a 1. It's invisible, right? B is always the number touching x. What is it in our equation? 2. C is always the number that isn't touching any x's. What is it in our equation? -5, and I'm glad we grabbed that negative sign. If you say 5, you're going to get the wrong answer. -5. It's okay? And then we're going to take those three numbers and we are going to substitute them into this wonderful formula right here. So what I'm going to do, and I encourage you to do this too, is write down x equals, I'm going to copy the shell of that formula, but every time I see one of those letters, A, B, or C, I'm going to put empty parentheses, which will fill in with numbers after we get the shell. So here's what the formula says, -b, but I'm going to put negative parentheses to be filled in. The next thing in the formula, plus or minus, copy that. The next thing is a big square root symbol, copy that. The next thing is b squared, but instead of b squared, I'm putting parentheses squared. And then it says -4ac. That's going to be -4 parentheses, other parentheses, okay? And that's all divided by 2a, 2 parentheses. That is the shell for the quadratic formula. Like I said, all these parentheses are about to get filled in with the numbers a, b, and c in the right spots. If you do want to put something on your formula sheet for the quadratic formula, I'm going to give you the quadratic formula, so you don't need that. But if you wanted to put that shell on your formula sheet, I don't think that's a bad idea. Every quadratic formula problem for me is going to start with that shell. Okay, and now it's just a simple matter of inserting those numbers. So the first thing in our formula was -b. I've got my negative sign. What am I putting for b? 2. You just put it in those parentheses. The next parentheses, what letter is it supposed to be? That's also b, so it is also 2. The next letter in the parentheses is what letter? A. What is that? 1. Put a 1. Next letter? C. -5. Make sure you get that negative in there. And then finally on the bottom, A, which is 1. One of the places I've seen folks go wrong with the quadratic formula is just not being careful with these parentheses here and not filling them in the right spots. So if you just have your shell with all the empty parentheses, I think it's very easy to put everything in the right spot. Okay, so now we're going to start doing arithmetic on all of this stuff. So that's just a -2. I don't need the parentheses anymore. Plus or minus, we'll talk about that. Big square root 2 squared. That's easy. That's 4. Okay, next thing I like to do is deal with the sign before I deal with the arithmetic. So take a look. This is a subtract, and there's another negative sign somewhere in those three things. Is this ultimately a plus or a minus? That is a plus because there are 2 negative signs, yes? So I am putting plus. I have dealt with the negative signs. I am now seeing only positive numbers in this expression. So I am seeing 4 times 1 times 5, all positive. That's easy, that's 20. So this is just 4 plus 20. But it's really easy to go wrong right there and say 4 minus 20. So all I do is count those signs and write my final answer. So for example, if this just temporarily were a negative sign there, would the whole thing be plus or minus at the end? That would be minus because there's 3 minuses. What if that was not there, but this was a plus? What would the whole thing be at the end? Minus, because there's only 1 minus sign in that case, right? That's all the possibilities. Just count your minus signs. You know what to do with it. Put a plus or a minus and then be done with all those signs. Okay, that whole thing is divided by 2 times 1. That's just 2. Okay, let's keep going. This thing here equals, do you have any more space or do we need to go to another? Maybe we need to go to another page. So is there room, maybe on the previous page we can continue this one? Let's put it right down here. If you haven't done the quick check, we can put it, where do we have space? There's space here? Equals. Okay, so we had -2 plus or minus. And now all we're doing is adding the numbers inside of that radical. It was 20 plus 4, 24, all divided by 2. It's okay? Yeah, so this is continuing problem from here. This is what we're solving. Yeah. Okay, so turns out we have to go farther with this thing. If we can simplify that radical, then we're supposed to. And we talked on the previous quest about how to simplify radicals like square root of 24. 24 is not a perfect square, but we can still try to find a perfect square that goes into 24. Our perfect squares are up here in yellow. Which one goes in? What perfect square in the bottom row here goes into 24? Is 4. And so we're going to rewrite that guy, -2 plus or minus square root of, instead of 24, we'll put 4 times something, 4 times 6 in this case, right? Lots of copying, copied everything except the one small change. 24 became 4 times 6. Okay, lots of copying again, -2 plus or minus. And the point of factoring 24 in this particular way is that the square root of 4 comes outside. What is it? 2. And the square root of 6, that's still there, right? So the 4 came outside, 6 stays inside. So that's old. That is how we simplify square root of 24. Don't forget, it's still all divided by 2. Okay, now there's a lot of 2's floating around here, and it sure feels to me like maybe some 2's on the top. 2's on the top can maybe cancel with the 2 on the bottom. But the way that we do this is something we talked about in a previous class, and that's to split this thing up first into 2 fractions. Both of them are going to have this denominator of 2. So the first fraction plus or minus the second fraction. They both have a 2 as their denominator, and the numerator just gets split up into our 2 different fractions. So -2 to radical 6. Okay, and then finally you reduce your 2 fractions independently. First fraction is -1 plus or minus. Second fraction, the 2's cancel. You can't do anything with that 6. 6 is protected under that square root, so don't make the 6 a 3 by canceling it with the 2 in the bottom. But the 2's cancel, and we're just left with radical 6, no more fraction. That's it. And so what does this mean? All right, this really means 2 different answers, and I don't actually need you to write it out this way. But that plus or minus is a shorthand, and once you're comfortable with what it means, it's easy. But it really means -1 plus radical 6 is one answer. We were looking for values of x to solve an equation. That's one of them. And the other answer, I'll just put a comma here because I'm listing, is -1 minus radical 6. 2 different answers. The plus or minus is just shorthand for us to say these 2 things that are quite similar to each other, but different. And I need us to be able to type this thing into the calculator. And so you're going to have a chance to do this in the activity, so you don't need to follow along here. You don't need to do this right now on your own calculator. But let's see if we can get 2 decimals. If you just type in -1 plus, oopsies, -1 plus the square root of 6, we get 1.449. Remember, we were finding x-intercepts. 1.4 was our guess for that x-intercept. Okay, a more accurate answer is this one right here, 1.449 and change, right? I mean, there's no way you're going to get that accuracy from the graph, but that was our guess. It was pretty close to the right answer, although technically the right answer goes forever. Like even this is rounded, even with all these digits here. And if we want the other answer, -1 minus the square root of 6. And that's it right there, okay? And that is close to our guess from before. Now, this guy was easy-ish to type in because lots of the fraction stuff disappeared. But sometimes the fraction stuff doesn't disappear. And so I need us to be able to type it in from here. And so I'll show you how to do that real quick. So if I type it in as it looks right now, -2 plus 2 radical 6, all divided by 2. If you say this thing that I've typed, and you say this thing that we've written, you're going to be saying the same exact thing. But I've made a mistake when I typed it in. This is not the right answer, right? We got 1.449. Remember that was the answer before? This is not it. The fact that it's close is just a coincidence. It's not right. Anybody see where we went wrong here? Yeah, Jeremiah. Yeah, the thing that's getting divided by the 2 in this case is just the 6, but that's not what this says. So, okay, let's fix that. So if I put some parentheses right there, is that the right answer? No, that's not it either. So here's the problem. The thing that's getting divided by 2 is just this radical piece. But really what's supposed to get divided by 2 is the entire thing. So, okay, one more shot at this. I need to put parentheses around the entire numerator. Extra parentheses that don't exist in the written version of this. This is going to give us the right answer. This is saying take the entire numerator, it's enclosed in big outer parentheses, and divide it all by 2. That's one of our answers. It is really easy to mess up here when you type this thing in the calculator. So my recommendation is that you actually not try to type it in one shot, which we just did there, but instead you do it in 2 shots. The numerator by itself, there's the numerator. -2 plus 2 radical 6, right? That's just up here. And then hit equals, and then divide the entire thing by 2, and we will get the right answer every time. I recommend that way. You don't have to worry about inserting parentheses that weren't required when you wrote the thing. And then if you want to do the other one, it's -2 minus 2 radical 6. Again, I'm just doing this as it's just by itself as the numerator, and then divide the whole thing by 2, and we get the right answer there. So I think that all that stuff is screenshotted on a couple of pages away. So right there. Okay. Either option, I think this first option is better. Okay, last one here, and then you'll jump in on the activity. Is solving this equation right there. What's not so thrilling about that equation? Anything in there you don't like? Fractions. So my recommendation is to get rid of the fractions right from the very beginning. There is a denominator of 3. I'm going to multiply everything by that denominator of 3. So I'm going to multiply this side of the equation by 3, and I'm going to multiply that side of the equation by 3. And so when we do that, the 3 distributes here. So 3 times this first term is what? -6x squared, that's good. Minus, and then the 3 comes in and distributes by, to the second fraction. Now, if you say 21, you're not saying what I want you to say. The whole point of putting that 3 was to cancel this 3 in the denominator. So that's what it does. The 3 cancels the 3, and what's left? -7x. I don't want you to say 21 over 3. It's silly. The point of the 3 was to cancel it. So just straight cancel it. Okay, equals is really easy to make this mistake. -1 is not right. What should it be? -3, multiplying both sides by 3. Even though we were focused on the left-hand side, because that was where the fraction was we were trying to get rid of, need to do the same thing on both sides. Okay, another temptation is to grab A, B, and C right now. Don't write this down, but it sure looks to me like A is -6, and B is -7, and C is -3. 2 of those are right, but one of them is wrong. What's the problem? -3. The equation, the quadratic formula, works assuming that you have what magic number on one side? 0. And if you don't have 0, you are not ready to use the quadratic formula. So this is not right, but instead you get 0 by adding the 3 to both sides. And so now how much is the value of C? It's +3. Right? You can see there's a few subtle ways to, like, they're easy to make mistakes on with this quadratic formula. All right, So what I want you to do is, why don't you go ahead and continue this one? We'll just kind of start the activity here and then continue on to the next page. So the quadratic formula is written out for you right there. The values of A, B, and C are up there in green. I'm going to pass out calculators. You won't need them on this one, but on the other questions in the activity you will.